Norse stories. Baldr. The great god Odin was the father of all the gods. He and his children dwelt in the city of Asgard, at the end of the rainbow. Odin's palace was as high as the sky and roofed with pure silver. In it was a throne of gold. When Odin sat upon the throne, he could see all over the world. Each day he sat upon the throne to see if everything was as it should be on the earth. He loved the people and the animals and all the beautiful things of earth, because they were the work of his hands. Odin had 2 ravens, which were as swift as thought. Every day he sent the ravens to fly over the oceans and over the land to see if any harm was being done. When they came back, they perched upon his shoulders and whispered in his ear all that they had seen. Besides this, there was a watchman who never slept. He was called Heimdall, the white god. He stayed always at the foot of the rainbow, which was the bridge of the gods, to see that the frost giants did not come into Asgard, and to listen to the sounds of earth. So sharp were his ears that he could hear the grass and the wool on the sheep's backs growing. One day, when Odin mounted his throne, he saw that the earth was no longer green and beautiful. The air was full of snowflakes, and the ground was as hard as iron. All was dark and cold. The ravens, which had been sent out to see if all was well, came hurrying back to tell Odin that Hodr, the blind old god of darkness, had taken possession of the earth. Heimdall, the watchman, called that he could no longer hear the music of the waterfalls and birds and all the pleasant sounds of earth. Everything was mute with fear of the terrible god of darkness. Odin called the gods together, and they looked with pity on the great earth, which had been so pleasant a place. Thor, the strong god, offered to go with his hammer and fight with the god of darkness, but Odin knew that Hodr could hide himself away from Thor. Then Baldr, the beautiful, the god of light, whom all the gods loved, offered to go. So Odin gave him his winged horse Sleipnir, and he rode away across the rainbow bridge. As soon as the light of Baldr's shining eyes fell upon the poor cold earth, it brightened and stirred. But the old blind god Hodr brought all his forces of darkness to resist the god of light, and the earth lay as if dead. Baldr struck no blows as Thor, the strong god, wished to do. He did not even try to resist the god of darkness. He only smiled upon the earth and called to it to awake. At last the blind god turned and fled before the light of Baldr's face. Then the streams leaped up and sang, and the birds came back, and the flowers bloomed, and the trees put on their gayest blossoms to greet him. The squirrels and rabbits came out of the places where they had hidden themselves and danced and frisked with joy. Never had the earth been so beautiful. But Hodr, the blind god in his realm of darkness, was only waiting for an opportunity to take possession of the earth again. So Odin permitted Baldr's mother to cross the rainbow bridge to help her son. The goddess went through all the earth, begging each plant and stone and tree not to harm her son, who had brought them nothing but blessings. And every tree and shrub and tiny plant and every rock and pebble and every stream and little brook promised gladly. Only the mistletoe, which grows high up in the oak tree and not upon the ground, and as other plants do, was forgotten. Loki, who was a meddlesome god, always doing something wrong, found out that the mistletoe had not given the promise and told Hodr. Hodr thought that because it was so little and weak it could not really kill the god, so he shot an arrow tipped with a tiny twig of mistletoe at Baldr. The arrow pierced through and through the beautiful god, and he fell dead. Then the earth put off her green robe and grew silent and dark for a time. But because Baldr, the beautiful, had once lived on earth, Hodr could only make it cold half the year and dark half the day. And even now, if you listen, in the winter you can hear the wind moan through the trees, which fling their great arms in grief. And on summer mornings, very early, you'll find the stones and the grass wet with weeping in the darkness. But when the sun shines, the tears are turned to diamonds and the earth is glad, remembering Baldr the good. I heard a voice that cried, Baldr the beautiful is dead, and through the misty air passed like the mournful cry of sunward sailing cranes. Baldr the beautiful, god of the summer sun, fairest of all the gods. Light from his forehead beamed, runes were upon his tongue, as on the warrior's sword. All things in earth and air round were by magic spell, never to do him harm, even the plants and stones, all save the mistletoe, the sacred mistletoe. Hodr, the blind old god, whose feet are shod with silence, pierced through that gentle breast with his sharp spear by fraud, made of the mistletoe, the accursed mistletoe. The Fenrir's wolf. Loki was a mischievous fellow. He was always getting the other gods into trouble. Sometimes they shut him up, but they always let him out because he was so cunning that he could help them to do things they could not do for themselves. Once, he crossed the rainbow bridge to Jotunheim, the land of the giants, and brought home a giantess for his wife. Very strange children Loki had. One of them was the Fenrir's wolf. He was named Fenrir. All the gods knew he was a wolf as soon as they saw him. But he went about among the children, playing with them like a good-natured dog, and the gods thought there was no harm in him. Fenrir grew larger and larger, and the gods began to look at him with distrust. They feared he might someday grow too strong for them, but Fenrir always looked good-natured and harmed no one. He did not even show that he had great strength, so the gods could not have the heart to kill him. But they put it off too long. One day they found Fenrir had grown so strong that it was almost too late to do anything with him. All the gods worked day and night until they had forged the chain they thought strong enough to bind the wolf. Knowing they could not bind Fenrir against his will, all the gods came together for games. Thor crushed mountains with his hammer. The other gods showed their strength by lifting and leaping and wrestling. Then they brought out a chain and told Fenrir to let them bind him with it, so that he might show his strength by breaking it. Fenrir knew that he could break the chain, so he allowed himself to be bound. He only drew in a deep breath, and the chain dropped into pieces. Then the gods forged a chain thrice as strong as the first. Fenrir saw that this chain would be hard to break, but breaking the first chain had made him stronger, so he allowed this one to be put on him. This too he broke, and the gods were in despair. They knew they could never make a stronger chain, and they feared the wolf more than ever. Odin took his horse Sleipnir and went on a 7 days journey to the home of the dwarfs. They lived deep down in the earth, and had charge of the gold and diamonds and all of the other precious things. They were the most cunning of blacksmiths. When Odin told the little people what he wanted, they all cried, "Never fear, Father Odin, we can make a chain that will bind the wolf." When the chain was made, it was as light and delicate as a spider's web, but Odin knew it could never be broken. As soon as Fenrir saw the chain, he was afraid of it. He knew if it were only a cobweb, they would never care to put it on him. So he would not allow himself to be bound unless a god's hand was put into his mouth. At this, the gods only looked at one another. After a little time, Tyr, the bravest of all the gods, put his hand into the wolf's mouth. The moment the chain touched Fenrir, he knew he could never break it, and he bit off the god's hand. But the Fenrir's wolf was bound forever. Loki. One day, Loki was wandering about idly, as he often did. He came near Thor's house, which had 540 rooms. By the window sat Sif, Thor's wife, asleep. Loki thought it would be a good joke to cut off her beautiful hair and make Thor angry. So he crept in softly and cut off her hair close to her head without wakening her. When Thor came home and found out what had been done, he knew at once who had done it. Rushing out, he overtook Loki and threatened to crush him to atoms. To save his life, Loki swore to get the elves to make hair of gold for Sif that would grow like real hair. Loki knew he had better do as he had promised, so he went deep down into the earth to Alfheim. When he came near, he looked through a crevice in the ground, and there were the elves at work. He could see them by the light of the forge fires. Some were running about with aprons on, and with sooty faces. Some were hammering iron, and others were smelting gold. Some were cutting out rock crystals and staining them red for garnets and rubies. The elf women brought violets and the greenest grass to be found on the earth above. With these they stained crystals blue and green for sapphires and emeralds. Some of the elf women brought children's tears from the upper earth, and the gentlest elves changed them into pearls. As fast as they were finished, the jewels were carried away by the little elf boys and hidden in the ground, where they are found to this day. If you wish to see what cunning workmen the elves were, look at the shining faces and straight edges of quartz crystals, or at the beautiful coloring of emeralds and rubies. The little elf girls crept through the earth under the ocean and gave the pearls to the oysters to keep. Even now the oysters shut their shells tight and will not give up the pearls. Loki watched the little workman a long time, then he went in and told his errand. Nothing delighted the elves so much as to have work to do. They promised Loki the golden hair, and at once began to make it. A little elf ran in with a handful of gold, and an old grandmother spun it into hair. As she spun, she sang a magic song to give life to the gold. At the same time, the elf blacksmiths and goldsmiths set about making a present for Loki. The blacksmiths made a spear that would never miss its mark. The goldsmiths made a ship that would sail without wind. Besides, it could be folded up and put into the owner's pocket. Loki appeared before the gods with these wonderful things. To Odin he gave the spear, and to Frey the ship. Thor took the golden hair and put it upon Sif's head. Immediately it began to grow. At this, the gods pardoned Loki. When Loki went out, he began to boast that the sons of Evald, who had made the gifts, were the best workmen in the world. Brok, an elf of another family, heard him, and exclaimed angrily, "Sindri, my brother, is the best blacksmith in the whole world." Loki dared Brok to show him 3 gifts of Sindri's making, equal to the spear, the ship, and the hair. Brok hastened to Sindri and told him. The 2 brothers began to work at once. Sindri put a pigskin into the furnace and told Brok to blow the fire with the bellows while he went out. Brok worked with a will. Loki had followed him and now changed himself into a fly and stung Brok's ear. But Brok worked steadily, never stopping to brush it off. Sindri came back and took out the pigskin, and it had become a golden pig. So bright was it that it made the cave as light as day. Then Sindri put a little piece of gold into the furnace and went out again. Again, as Brok worked at the bellows, the fly came and stung him on the nose. But the elf did not stop for an instant. When Sindri took out the gold, it had become a magic golden ring. From it every 9th night dropped 8 golden rings. This time Sindri brought a piece of iron and put it into the furnace. Brok began his work, but Loki changed himself into a hornet and stung the elf on the forehead until the blood ran into his eyes. Brok bore it a long time, then he paused a moment to drive away the hornet. Just then his brother came in and said it was of no use to go on after he had once stopped. Sindri took out the iron, and it had become the mighty hammer Mjolnir, but the handle was a little too short. This was because the elf had stopped when the hornet stung him. Brok took the golden pig, the ring and the hammer to Asgard and presented them to the gods. Thor had just lost his hammer in a great fight with the Midgard serpent, so Mjolnir was given to him. This hammer could never be lost because it would always return to the owner. The pig, Golden Bristle, was given to the sun god Frey because he had to take long journeys in dark places. Odin kept the golden ring himself. The gods voted Sindri a better blacksmith than the sons of Evald. Brok demanded Loki's head, which had been wagered. The cunning Loki said he might have the head, but he must not touch the neck, so the elf did not get the head.